everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Science of Sales and Marketing. I'm Caitlin Honta, co-founder of Sirona Marketing, and I'm hosting today's session with my co-founder, Abdul Rastagar.
Hello.
Today, we're joined by Malia Lewin, who is an experienced life sciences strategy leader and founding partner at Bluebuck Ventures. Malia, thank you so much for joining us today. I love the origin story of your company's name, Bluebuck Ventures. Can you kind of explain a bit about the meaning behind this name, the importance of seeing Bluebucks versus unicorns in today's complex environment, and sort of what you do to service this industry?
Sure. Well, we founded Bluebuck Ventures September of last year. So we're coming up soon after the summer on our 1 year anniversary. And Jeremy and I, when we thought about the company and commercial strategy, we both have our origin at Veeva in terms of the pharma tech space. And one of the things we thought about was, Veeva is a unicorn to some degree, but they're a special unicorn being in the pharma tech space. And I think what has made them extremely successful is, the discipline that they show from a business model standpoint, being outcomes focused and being really capital, conscious, capital responsible. And so, we really thought about what does it mean for, companies from seed stage onward as they're trying to find success and find their foothold in this space. What are the things that they need to understand about operating that's a little bit different from the aspiring unicorns of the earlier days of startup, and so we have a few things that we talk about with our clients around what it means to be capital responsible, right? You want to be able to run lean, you want to make your investments where they matter, you want to leverage tech, especially now that we have AI. You really want to avoid any unnecessary investments. And, I think there was a time period where sales was first. I think, what we really want to see is customers being put first. And if you make your customers successful and you make your customers happy, that is going to serve your foundational business much more so than just focusing on revenue without having that focus on delivery. I think it's also about, from a management standpoint, having the courage to say no when you need to. And, when there are, sort of tempting squirrels, business squirrels that run across as an opportunity, really having the discipline to say, hey, that's outside our ICP. And that's going to draw more resources than it's going to deliver in terms of what we're trying to do with the business right now. I could go on. I mean, there are a couple more points here if, you would indulge me. I think it's really important it's never too early to think about value-based selling and understanding the value that you're delivering to your customers, really co-creating a story around that and asking them to join you, as you build your brand around customer success. The products that are most successful in this space are products that are reducing complexity. And so I'm sure we'll get to later the dreaded point solution label, but I think it's really important for startups to be thinking from the beginning, how am I reducing complexity in the business of my customers, and not creating more work for them.
The concept of the term that has come about of like a blue buck versus a unicorn. You alluded to Veeva, where all of us worked at one point or another being a unicorn. And that concept of business existing is a lot different in this day and age. Like what Veeva could do in 2011, 2012. I think Veeva was founded in 2007, actually. The business was really evolving and growing at a much different time than companies and startups in this space now. And I actually hear multiple clients that we talk with who view Veeva as a model, which is great, but there's a different operational, just a different focus of what you need to do to be a unicorn in the time Veeva was versus a unicorn or a blue book now.
Yeah.
Like, how do you kind of think about with the clients that you're talking to, if they're saying, hey, I want to look at this model as something to strive for, but how different the space is now and what the real focus should be for them and what that term really means, like what is being a unicorn in today's world, or a blue buck if we want to use that term instead.
Yeah. Of course I want to use that term instead.
Yeah, we're switching to
branding, right?
Official. Yeah. It's official. We're switching to Bluebuck right out now.
Yeah, I know.
Well, it's a loaded question, but I would say certainly everybody wants to be Veeva, but it's a multi-billion-dollar company, and you have to start somewhere, right? And so what we've tried to do is take some of those principles that really made Veeva stand out among unicorns and try to bring them down to a level where everybody can use them when you're starting a business. I would say that the key for the key difference that I think about is really how you're growing your company, and how you're growing your business. In the earlier days, with the big unicorns, I mean, I'm talking even outside of life sciences, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uber and, some of those larger companies. It was about, if you're not hiring, you're not growing. Right. And so there were these people were using certain indicators of growth that really weren't grounded in how healthy the business was and how well the business was actually doing. And so I think people learned a lot from that period of time. Sure, in order to hit $1 billion, you need to grow quickly. But, I think what we've learned is you have to be product focused. You have to be, willing to invest in your product and your platform strategy. So the idea is you have an ideal customer profile. You have 3 to 5 customers that fit within that profile that show that you have strong product market fit, that you're starting to get demand and momentum behind the product, and that the business development that you've done as a founder can really be what grounds a sales force. So I think those are really like the key growth metrics that you want to use as you're making investments into the business, and not just making investments for the sake of making investments and saying that because you're making investments, therefore you're growing. So it's sort of flipping it around a little bit. I'm sure you guys have an opinion also on what makes today's Bluebucks different from yesterday's unicorns.
Well, I do, but I actually want to ask a question about that. You said, having the ICP defined. Do you find when you're advising these companies that it's hard for them to identify an ICP, or they're going to have like 5 different ones and they can't really focus because they don't want to lose potential clients, right? So they're like, this is our ICP. And all of a sudden you have this menu of like 6 different types of profiles, which is not really an ICP. Do you come across that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would say that the phrase I've come to use is, are you doing business development or are you doing sales, as a founder, right? And I think that there is a period for any business where you're doing business development. You're trying to figure out exactly who your customer is, and you're validating a hypothesis you have about who you think it is. And you have a lot of flexibility in your business model, even in your pricing structure, and you're doing sort of custom deals almost in that business development phase as you're trying to define, who your customer is going to be. But I think very quickly thereafter, you start to think about, okay, I've sold, 2 or 3 customers in this category, in this segment. Am I seeing a pattern here that could potentially, lead me to an ideal customer? And then understanding what the size of that market could be and whether there's enough in there to support your business, right? So you can't choose an ICP that's so narrow that the market size is not big enough to make investors interested or to sustain you, or if it is so small, you need to understand where you're going from there, and quickly move ahead and have a strategic build to capture market share as you grow. But certainly, I do run into that, Abdul, and I think that that's really, a lot of people want to scale the sales force before they're ready, and having that conversation and understanding whether you're doing business development or you're ready for sales is a really important one to have.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk to clients, it feels like a lot of times we have the same conversation, especially if it's an early stage client, that they're all about tactics. What do we do, right? How do we hire salespeople? What do we do from a marketing perspective, et cetera? And we always can try and bring it back to, well, let's come back to the foundation, right? What's your message? What's your ICP? What's your unique value proposition? Let's start there. And in my experience, our experience, a lot of founders just want to kind of skip over that. Right. And they don't understand how important that is, right? Because they're thinking pure tactics.
It also just goes to show how important the details are within that metric, because we've also seen scenarios where companies have multiple customers, but those customers aren't repeatable examples of success. It's like edge case. Everyone is an edge case, or required a high degree of like customization, or, a lot of hands-on service, whatever the detail is. And on paper, yeah, we have 5 customers. That's looking great. We're seeing a signal of customer growth. But if you actually dig in, there's no repeatability across for a specific ICP. And like what actually is an ICP? Like how specific do you get within that criteria to really say this is something rinse and repeat? And then to your point, is this market big enough, or is this okay to focus on now, but we need to, have one foot here and one foot looking towards what is our expansion, possibility outside of this very narrow focus. Though I've also seen people get too ahead of themselves and try to do both at the same time, of selling narrow, but also maintaining that larger vision. And then they get kind of fragmented with their focus. You mentioned squirrel brain. That's a common thing. If I only go really, really specific, I'm going to close the door to all these other potential audiences that I could serve in the future. That's absolutely something we also see a lot of, and it can be really hard to kind of convey that, to a founder, especially when they feel so much pressure from usually investors to show some element of growth. It's like, hey, I have these 5 customers. Why can't that count for something?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think sometimes there's also a misread of there's a lot of inbound interest all of a sudden because word gets out that you're doing something exciting. And so people start calling. And the instinct of the founder is to say, hey, we got to get salespeople in here to go close all this business that's coming in. And then they hire a bunch of salespeople and they have a bunch of people standing around that don't know how to close that business because you really don't have an outreach to close motion, right? And that interest is just interest, right? Those are not necessarily pipeline, opportunities. What you've done is you've generated some interest and you're having some conversations. But making the mistake of thinking that all of those are going to lead to closable opportunities, really, a lot of people fall for that. And they end up hiring salespeople and having a lot of people in payroll standing around needing direction as to how they go about closing, how they go about developing this interest into opportunities, and then how those opportunities are going to move through a closable funnel.
Yeah. Another thing that I've seen is like misalignment on what an ICP is. So you'll start, this company will start in the academia, and all the academics, they're like, hey, we love it, right? But they're trying to sell to whatever provider systems. And there's a big difference there between the two of them, right? So we're like, well, it's really getting great adoption here, even though it's free or close to free, right? And now you're trying to go into like either a provider system or maybe an enterprise pharma. And that's not quite the same persona, right? It's not the same set of priorities and requirements that they have. I've come across that.
No, and you have an MBA. I think, some of it is about going back to the fundamentals, right? And thinking about, okay, well, what is my financial target, right? How much do I need to sell in order to keep the lights on? What do I need to show in order to get my next round of investment? And then saying, okay, if that's what my target is, how do I get there, right? How do I look at the opportunities out there, the whole market, and how do I cut it up into addressable pieces that are going to allow me to hit that financial target if I'm able to sell to everybody within that market that I think I can sell to, right? So it's just your TAM, SAM, SOM work that you have to do. That's one of those things where it isn't fluff. It's a very practical question. And I think it's really important for both running the business and also showing investors that you understand your business. And so I think the ICP and your TAM, SAM, SOM analysis really have to go hand in hand.
It's funny you say that. So you and I have worked on that together in the past, right? Especially when you did 90% of it. Let's not sugarcoat it, right?
No.
But I think a lot of people will do like a very superficial, well, this target, the market is like X billion. Of course I'm gonna go in there, even if I get a small fraction of the share. But if you really start to dig into it, it's so much more complex than that, right? You have so many different variables to think through in order to really understand your TAM SAM. What do you think is probably like some of the most important criteria that people should look out for
in terms of defining the TAM, SAM, SOM? Well, I mean, I think it's tempting. It's always tempting to paint a picture of a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. But most investors are going to look at that and it's just not believable that you're going to be able to address that market as a tiny company just starting out, right? So I think what you need to do, especially in our industry, is really understand, okay, well, what problem am I solving? Again, fundamentals. How big is that problem? So if it's, where does it sit? Do I have an R&D problem that I'm trying to solve? Do I have a commercial problem that I'm trying to solve? And then really understanding, drilling down, not just into what the opportunity is, but also understanding who else is out there that's also capturing, some of that market today, right? And what is their chunk worth? So really getting very specific about what do you think you can go get out of that chunk realistically, and I think that a lot of founders miss the mark because they're trying to paint a picture of a massive investment opportunity, right? And what is better to do is to show that you really understand how you're going to attack this a little bit at a time. I think that's the most important picture to paint.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that, like the context. Well, two things we see, but one of the things is who you're going after or who the competition is, who you're up against. It's not always a clear, here's a group of other solutions. It could be a variety of different solutions. It could be no solution. It could be something built in-house. It's not an easy map in this industry to just say, there's a whole bucket of things that exist in this category. That's who I'm competing with. It could be a
Right.
lot of different things, which makes it even more complex, also makes budgeting complex. You've probably heard this many times where, we're trying to sell a solution, but there's no budget that's been assigned to this solution. This is happening,
Right.
a lot with AI now. And so it's like, from the buyer's perspective, they don't understand how to think of what you're doing from the context of their budget, even if they see value from a business perspective, and that just can complicate the cycle. So, there's extra layers there. And then one of the other things we see a lot, which I'm sure you see too, is that question of like, what problem does this solve and for who? That, especially with AI, there could be, I don't know, 30 groups and 30 questions or answers to that question. And we see a lot of founders coming in and saying, oh, it's so flexible, it can do so many different things. But obviously, then anyone understanding whatever audience you decide to go after within the large pharma landscape, it's way too hard for them to draw those connections, even if the solution is really that flexible or widespread.
Yeah. I think the first question I would ask, right, is, well, who are you going to go after first and why? And then really understanding if the founder has clear metrics that they're looking at to prove out, right, with the first couple use cases before they move on. Right. So the ICP should not be a static thing. It should evolve over time. No one's expecting you to have the exact right hypothesis about your ICP from the beginning, right? You have to be able to take a good shot, a well-researched, benchmarked shot at what you think your ICP is. Define it well. What roles, not just what companies fit into that, but what roles are you selling to? Who's your user? Who's your buyer? Who else is going to influence the decision, in these accounts? And really try to get as clear as possible, not only about, what the opportunity looks like once you close it, but how long is it going to take you to close it? Like that, what is the average cycle? Really trying to get as specific as you possibly can with what your belief is about that ICP, and then evolving it with real information as you go, and being willing to pivot and bring in other segments as you need to. But doing that work, and this goes back to something you guys said before, you can't just throw marketing at the problem and throw messaging at the problem and just, or throw sales reps at the problem, right? Like you need to really understand and have a strategy for how you're going to solve your commercial problem. I mean, I don't know, it's not necessarily a problem, I guess, but in terms of designing your commercial business model, like how you're going to go after this, there needs to be a plan, and there needs to be a strategy, and there needs to be a forecast, and you need to have all of these things in place. They're not luxury items, they're essential. And then you need to use market intelligence to evolve your understanding of your ICP, of your forecast. You need to change your plan. You need to be able to be nimble, but it's worth doing the work on strategy.
One of the things that I always kind of think about is that people underestimate in our industry how long the sales cycles are, right? Mm-hmm. So when you do build that forecast, I'm going to get like 20 clients this quarter or whatever, right? Well, you may be talking to 20 clients. Chances of closing them at this, especially as they get larger, it's probably unlikely, right? We're talking 12 plus months sales cycles, right? And sometimes 8. I've been on 2 18 plus month sales cycles, right? And that's not unusual. So I think people often underestimate, like, just because the user loves the particular product, the organization may not be able or may not be willing to adopt it at that rate, right?
That's right. And, I think usage and adoption is, it's always a challenge with tech, especially, in pharma. And really, that goes back to one of the things we talked about earlier on, customer success, and making sure that you're demonstrating that your customers are successful on the platform in metrics that are important to you and also important to the customer, and having that be a cornerstone of what you're building.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've sort of talked to this notion that there's obviously these fundamental pieces that companies need to see momentum in before they're ready to think about scale. Then another problem we see is, that going from that 0 to 1, getting out of the founder-led sales, or okay, now you're ready to start hiring out your leadership team. How should companies think about that? Like, who should they prioritize hiring when they're ready to start building out a leadership team? I know there's been a lot of changes of like the CRO versus the CMO. Now CMOs are kind of, and I mean CMO as chief marketing officer, not chief medical officer, but that role's evolving and changing. Like, how should organizations think about that, and what type of people should they look for?
Well, that is a big question too. It's all big questions here in this on this podcast. One of the reasons we started Bluebuck was because Jeremy and I saw a lot of early stage companies recruiting us. They wanted a chief revenue officer, or they wanted a chief commercial officer, and we simply just did not think they were ready for it, and we didn't think it was a responsible decision to put for us to enter into these organizations with a limited likelihood that we could be successful based on what the business needed to do at the time. So I think when you're hiring for C-level, you really need to think about where the business is, right? You're hiring C-level employees for their ability to lead, for their ability to be good thought partners for the CEO, for their ability to help really grow and scale the business. So you need to have all of those three things before you hire in C-level people, right? So if there's no one to lead, do you really need a C-level leader, or do you need more of a VP level person who's going to focus on execution rather than focusing on strategy? If the CEO is still running, a large bit of the day-to-day, whether it's product or sales, do they really have the time for thought partners? Or are you just going to have a bunch of C-level people in their offices just waiting to have strategic conversations for the CEO to have bandwidth? In that case, maybe an advisory board is better. So when the CEO has time to step out of the business, they can consult with advisors. And that third component is really around growth. You're hiring C-level people who can help take your business to the next level. If your business is still working on its foundation, then really what you need are people who are going to help you, build that foundation. So I would say it's important to bring in C-level people. There are also a lot of founders who make the mistake of trying to promote from within, people who are very good at execution, but don't understand strategy and growth, right? So you do need C-level people eventually, but you just can't hire them too early, or it's just going to be a major draw on your financial resources before you're going to be getting the value that you need from them.
Do you have any perspective from the kind of context of thinking about when you do hire those commercial leaders, the sales versus the marketing, or how to think about that? I mean, one thing we're seeing a lot of is this elimination, like I said, of the CMO, or consolidation where marketing is starting to fall more under revenue or sales. Do you have a perspective on that? Yeah, Abdul's going to thumbs that down.
I think one of the great values of marketing is the ability to see patterns in customer success, and then to take those patterns and use them to, build the audience and create opportunity from like customers who will be touched, moved, and inspired by the success of people who have been on platform for a while. So I think when you're looking at your marketing team, you have to have enough data to really be able to do that if you're going to have a brand that's built off of value, which I believe in very strongly. And I also believe that marketing and sales should really be working hand in glove. I love the model of sales and marketing, being siblings reporting up to a chief commercial officer who sees both, rather than having that contentious environment between marketing and sales. But I think enough data equates to 10 or 20 roughly customers that you have on platform or using your product. They don't necessarily need to all be current. It depends on, the business. But you need enough evidence of wins, losses, customers who've been successful, maybe even some that have, come on and then decided not to renew. All of this data, I think, should drive your marketing engine. And on the sales front, I think you really need to start with reps. You need to start with people who are out there in the field, bringing messages back and forth. This worked, this didn't work. The product needs, to do this. These features are less compelling. Those types of nimble sales folks will get you quite far, till you hit the 1 to 5 million in ARR, and you really need a leader in there to help direct traffic, to help understand more holistically what's going on across territories, to really help coach the reps on that repeatable sales process. But as you're defining it, you really need more execution and less strategy, is how I would think about it. I don't know how you guys feel from more of the marketing side.
You're going to get a biased answer.
That's okay.
All right, Caitlin, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would agree with you, Malia, on the point you made earlier of seeing companies try to hire like a C-level person too early. That doesn't always happen, but there have been times where a company is like, we need a head of marketing, or actually we see two things. They're either trying to hire too senior too quickly and they're not ready for that, or they think, oh, we just need someone to come in and run lead gen, or come in and like do events, but they don't think of marketing in the way of helping be a strategic lever.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's going to fail as well because they have someone running lead gen on an ICP that doesn't yet exist or isn't yet defined. And a marketer who's good at that from the perspective of knowing how to generate leads can get to a number, but that number is going to be meaningless if some of these bigger questions haven't been figured out. I do think that maybe, Abdul, you have a different perspective from like how marketing is defined. I'm less worried about the title and more worried about the function being represented, because I do think marketing brings a unique perspective of the like up and downstream, or at least the
Mm-hmm.
people who have the marketing strategy mind. And when marketing isn't brought in early enough, there's not that. I mean, you kind of called it pattern matching, but there's not that longer term, bigger building towards, the future version. Usually sales is very tied to meeting a specific revenue number and only focusing initiatives there. Whereas with marketing, you bring a lot more things in, brand, all these other initiatives that are important but harder to measure. And so having someone who sees that piece and how to manage it from an earlier stage, you don't need to be spending $500,000 on your website, but building the foundation for those pieces, having that point of view is really important. But what does that mean in terms of what the role looks like? I don't know. I'm open-minded, and I also feel like in early stage, everyone's doing a bit of everything. Like sales is doing customer discovery, so are marketers, so is product, so is the CEO. So I'm less worried about the title and more worried about, do you have the person there who knows marketing and is going to think about how you're approaching your business strategy from that
And
lens.
who's really like waking up thinking about it every morning, right? I mean, I think that's the part where it's a slippery slope, right? If you wait too long to put in professional people thinking about marketing, then you don't have somebody who's focused on, thinking about that until it's too late. And by too late, I mean, we're in a competitive space for the most part, and I think the piece of brand is not a luxury when it comes to differentiation, right? There are a lot of technologies, there are a lot of services-based organizations that are trying to sell into pharma and biotech B2B. It's a crowded environment. You can't be only brand. You have to have you have to have substance, you have to have ROI metrics, you have to be able to show value. You need your referenceable customers. But when it comes to companies feeling like their values aligned with their partners, understanding, trusting, and really understanding, who they're buying from, those all become really important. The more competitive the space is. Right. And you can really only do that from marketing because, demonstrated things like thought leadership is another piece, right? Like the idea that the space, you understand your customers' problems, in a way that's unrelated to your, the features of your product. Those are things that build trust in a way that sales does not. People can spot a salesperson. They're very good at what they do. I love sales people that I've ever coached, mentored, led. I love you all. But it's a very different thing than creating a brand and a set of beliefs that really help push deals over the line.
Well, I mean, Malia, you and I, we experienced that firsthand, right? We drove that at Viva years ago when it was medical affairs, went from like, we went from a very, very small, basically nothing department, right? To having substantial market share. And it was done through thought leadership. It was you and Brian and Robert, right? Out there talking to clients at conferences, doing these roundtables. And it was never sales pitches. It was all about the thought leadership, right? And
right.
I distinctly remember we more than doubled market share in a very short amount of time because that was our strategy.
It gets you into rooms that salespeople don't get into.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And that's the piece that I think sometimes people miss, right? Is, you can get higher up in organizations, you can get invited to conferences, there are opportunities and doors that are open to you using thought leadership and other, brand building marketing activities that are not on the nose, that are not just about enabling the sales force. That's an important part of marketing's job, but it's not their only job.
And the problem here is that there's a level of, I guess, patience that's required with thought leadership, right? Because it takes time to build that trust and credibility. It doesn't happen overnight. So you have to build this whole engine around it but you also have to give it a runway. And in the meantime, you're looking for results. Where am I selling? Where are my new opportunities? And those aren't initially aligned, right? That they come together over time. And that's a consistent problem that I see. So when, certainly I always advocate thought leadership in many ways for clients. And then the question is, well, where are the results? And when you say the results are going to come down the line 6 months, 9 months later, right? A lot of people balk at that. And they're like, well, we'll figure this out later. Well, and then 6 months down the line, they're like, where are the sales? Well, you missed the foundation months ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
I
what
think that I would say the third prong of value, sorry, Caitlin, I didn't mean to jump in there,
No, please go.
is about, taking some pressure off a CEO. One of the things that I think marketing does well, in addition to sales enablement, in addition to brand building, is, a lot of founders build their businesses based on being customer facing. Customers get used to that. They want to talk to the CEO every single time. But, one of the things that we've done in the past, Abdul, is we've been able to help other executives step out into the world as subject matter experts on, the overarching trends in the industry, on pain points that the customer has, as well as an expert on the offering. And I think that, marketing being able to elevate other executives and allow the business to scale, that's often overlooked as a real value that marketing delivers. That is really not on the roles and responsibilities sheet of any other function in the organization. In a larger company too, it's like the VPs can't be everywhere all at once. You need to be able to elevate other executives, and there needs to be an escalation point to somebody who really has business savvy and has authority, right? It can't always be, especially if you're a global company. You need to be able to create those opportunities for other people. And then you also need your customers to see that, the people that they're interfacing with day to day, to get to know them. That was a really important thing. The last place where Abdul and I worked together, really elevating the customer facing teams who really got in there, rolled up their sleeves side by side with the client, helping to get to know those people and understand their passion about what they do in a different way. It's very infrequent that there would be occasion for a customer facing person working on the day to day to have a chance to talk about their passion for, the work, for patients, for science, for, for any of the things that we work on.
I feel like that's free mileage that's often missed, right? Elevating your executives' profiles is such a powerful tool for getting market traction, market awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And just some people just don't have it in them. Others poo-poo it for whatever reason. I feel like that's like a low-hanging fruit, or should be low-hanging fruit, when often it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, within the context of all this stuff, it just speaks to, and I think this is one of the reasons why it can be hard to know when or how to hire marketing, is marketing is just so many different things, and it's so much squishier than a lot of other functions.
Yeah.
And what you should be doing or what you should be investing in is highly variable based on stage, company size, industry, even the things that were working a year ago are no longer working. It's constantly evolving. There's so many variables. And so that's where, I think some people hire marketing and make a mistake. They hire the wrong person, or they hire, whatever. And so they think it's not a useful function, but it's so much more of it requires such a distinctive, specific strategy for each company, which is also one of the reasons why, like, we struggle with our business of, like, how do we scale this? What are repeatable playbooks that we could build and then sell? And those just don't exist. And some marketing groups or agencies or consultants will try to create a bundle of a thing, like, we only do this, so you can come hire us for this, but that's it. For us, we always are trying to take the approach of, okay, how can we help them solve their fundamental problem? And then every time we see patterns, but it's still a different engagement every time. And so I do think that's where sometimes companies struggle with marketing, because they think about it as, oh, marketing is lead gen, or marketing is emails, or marketing is social media. And that just is never going to be successful. And then also the piece Abdul mentioned, which some of these things are bets, it's 6 months, 9 months down the road of, it's like working out, you have to do the reps. But if you're not, if that's not something that's known to you, whether you're unfamiliar with marketing or you've never seen those things pay off, the skepticism makes sense. Like, it makes sense why leaders would be skeptical to invest in something like that. So, it's always balancing the, like, as a marketer, how can you generate a quick win or some quick wins while also continuing to give some attention to the longer term things like brand building and all of that, because those will be the things that pay off longer term.
Yeah, I think that that's right. It goes to not only do you have a lot of internal stakeholders as a marketing professional, right? As well as your external stakeholders, and you have your sales leader. They want MQLs that they can their team can follow up with. Often the investors are aligned with that, right? They want to see revenue within a certain amount of time. They want to see growth within a certain amount of time, usually like a 4-year window. They're less interested in what happens after that. You have your CEO that has a dream. They have a very clear idea, usually, of what the brand means to them, what they're trying to do over the long term. They want to see it grow. They want to see it flourish. You have your delivery team, right? That's always concerned about whether they can deliver if you drive too much demand. And so you have all these different, internal people that you're serving, and I think it can be challenging sometimes. There were times when, Abdul and I would say, like Abdul would, focus more on the day-to-day execution, and I would try to run interference, at the higher level, talking about sort of how what we were doing today was going to feed into the monthly metrics we were trying to hit, even though I knew that the things we were doing today might not deliver until, a couple of months out. It was just constantly this balancing act between making sure that we were serving every interest that was sitting at the table, which can really be challenging. It can be challenging in any company, at this stage, where you have your customer, you're serving 3 stakeholders: your employees, your customer, and your investors. Having a good idea of what messages you're delivering to each of those 3 groups and what metrics each of those 3 groups cares about is important. So,
yeah. So let me ask this, let me slight change in topic here. Have you come across founders who may have had happy years or had, like, they believe in their own vision so much where you feel like the market may not feel that way, right? And then how do you have that conversation about, let's make sure we have a reality check before we go full down this path? And have you come across that at all?
definitely, I think I'm a data-driven person. I know you guys are as well. And sometimes you need to, understand how things are resonating with a market before you really, go all in. And that's sort of, a lot of what we've talked about today around, having a repeatable sales process and having market demand and understanding your product market fit and your ICP. All of those are methods of collecting data so that you can make these decisions with some degree of confidence and evidence, that your investments are going to pan out. I think if you jump too early or you believe too much in your hypothesis such that you're ignoring all evidence to the contrary, or so either you're making these decisions without any evidence at all, or you're interpreting all the evidence incorrectly, it's not going to go well.
So how do you have that conversation, especially if somebody's kind of stubborn about it? Like, no, I believe this at the core of everything I do, right? Why wouldn't somebody want to buy this technology or use this tool? Because it's obviously so much better than anything they have. And you're looking at it from like the reality and experience of, well, enterprise adoption is very different than what you expect. Like, how do you have that conversation with them?
I bring my own data, just going back to being data driven. I think it means going and finding examples in the market of the cautionary tales, of people who jump too soon, as well as finding examples in the market of people who are very successful and saying, like, let's look at their, proof points, right, that are in their marketing. How did they gather those? How these are compelling, they have these referenceable case studies. They have, actual real world evidence and customers to back up what they're saying.
Right.
I think that can be really powerful, especially because almost every single founder has somebody or a company that they're trying to emulate, even if it's outside of their industry. The tunnel vision can really only be combated by opening up the aperture, right? And saying, this is who else is in your space. These folks have been successful. These folks haven't. Let's emulate the ones who have been successful and try to do more to follow that path.
I feel like the notion of going back to referenceable customers and proof points sounds so simple, but I mean, one of the things that we've alluded to earlier in this conversation is there's signals, or maybe you're hearing positive things, but those might not necessarily mean sales. It could just be that someone is having a feedback conversation with you and they think it's cool, or they're trying to be nice. And so they're acting positively on a call, a discovery call, but doesn't mean they're going to go and sign a contract and pay a bunch of money for your product. So it's like, okay, and do you actually have customers? And then are those customers actually willing to stand up and say, or stand behind your product? And then are they actually seeing tangible results? Like, it sounds so,
Yeah.
it's like that. Those are the core things. How easy it is to get off that track when you're having conversations with people in your ICP and you're just getting generally positive signal. You kind of think you're on the right path, but if none of them are ever actually signing, then how validated is that, or how true is the need? I mean, we have those conversations all the time. Like, we'll chat with someone who wants marketing help and they're, positive and excited, but if they don't sign a contract with us, it was, potentially doesn't amount to anything from the perspective of our business. Maybe we made a good connection, but they actually aren't willing to pay for the service, then, that doesn't
Yeah,
really
you
lead to
bring
that.
up a really important point, which is around the value of a win-loss analysis.
Yeah.
And I think you can't just analyze the wins and try to repeat them without also looking at the losses.
Yeah.
And you can't really believe everything you read in Salesforce.
Yeah.
You have to get out there with, it's where a small investment in a third party can really pay off.
Big time.
Because you will learn things from qualitative interviews conducted by a third party with, former prospects. Even if they've turned into customers, they will say things to that third party that they're just not going to say to you or somebody who works for your company.
Absolutely.
And getting that information really is just so important and will transform your commercial strategy, because you will understand about your competitors, about the pain points of the customer, even the sales process that's happening inside these companies that you don't always have a window into. So I think that that's a really key piece. And I've always seen that run through marketing.
I can't agree with you enough on that. It's got to be a third party. You cannot do this in-house and expect to have the right information from the client. They're going to be shy about why, want to hurt your feelings or whatever. They don't want to give their internal information away. They're going to be afraid that you're trying to sell them, use this as an opportunity to resell them, etc. You get a third party person to go talk to you. It's a neutral. You're going to get so much more valuable information than you would otherwise. Worth the investment.
Investors love it too. I mean, they're always trying to back channel to customers to find out what customers really think about their portfolio companies, if it's private equity or VCs. I mean, they're always interested in market research that's meaningful. So, you can do, customer satisfaction. You can do all of those things, and you should for a variety of different reasons. But a qualitative win-loss analysis is just the gold standard. And you'll be surprised how many customers are willing to participate and how many prospects are willing to participate, because they make a significant investment of time and energy into these processes. And afterward, they just throw the notebook goes into a file and is never seen again.
Yeah.
So being able to take the valuable information that they've gleaned from what was months of research and work and interviewing different vendors and all of that. I mean, they're very willing to participate. So it's worth it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Malia, we have had a great conversation. I'm looking at the clock. We're at 50 minutes. We could go for another 50 minutes.
We keep going, yeah.
We can keep going, but thank you so much for all of the just really great insights today. I would love to, I guess as a final question, you've already given tons of advice, but do you have any sort of parting advice you would like to share for kind of go-to-market leaders in this space? Or we've talked a lot about more the earlier stage in the CE. Any kind of last pieces or tidbits you want to share before we close?
I think we've done a really nice, I felt like I was just chatting with you. I don't feel like this is a podcast at all.
That's
so
what we want it to feel like. It's more fun
hopefully
that way
once it
for
gets
everyone.
edited.
No, we want our listeners to feel like they're just having a chat with us too. It's not, more fun for everyone.
I think, we've talked about lean first, being real careful and intentional about hiring. We've talked about, ideal customer profile and it being a live and evolving thing in your company. I think, this idea of balancing the brand objectives of marketing with, sales enablement, with, executive enablement, creating bandwidth for other members of the team, to step forward, building an audience, all of the real values, of marketing. I think, the one piece I would say is there is still this disconnect that I've seen between what investors want to hear and how they want to understand the view that they want to have of the business and the view that most commercial organizations are taking as they're managing the business day to day. And one of the things we've been trying to do at Bluebuck is really bring those two things together and create and build strategies and execution plans that are relevant for both audiences, so that you're not putting your commercial team in the position of having the burden of thinking about the business in two different ways. So if we were to meet again, I know Abdul and I could speak to that, because it's something that we faced in our last roles where we felt like we had two jobs basically. And I think it's really important to unite those two things if you're, going to have good relationships with your investors, and you need to hire the right people for that as well. You can't just hire for subject matter expertise in sales or marketing. If you're going to be putting folks in front of the board or in front of investors, or even, having folks engage with the CFO on a regular basis, you also need to hire for financial acumen and the willingness and interest in having those conversations. So if we were to have a part two to talk about how investors factor in, I would be happy to do that.
I was just going to say, I think we have to have a part two, because there's so much implications from also the marketing messaging side of, how do you message and be targeted to your audience, but knowing also that your investors are reading and seeing those same things. And if you're having a conversation about, here's our 5-year vision, and then your website speaks to, as it should, your customer that you're serving in the next year,
Right.
there's that disconnect as well. So yeah, I think we just need a part two, because we could probably have another 50 minutes on this topic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Malia. This was really fun. And I guess we'll be looking forward to the next conversation.
Definitely. And we only used the word AI once, I think, in this entire
word. That's hilarious.
I think I mentioned it once that
Yeah.
you want your sales team to use AI. Resource.
I think that's a first for us.
Yeah. I feel good about that, actually. I think I've been having too many conversations that are only AI focused. So awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks so much.